This meeting is being recorded.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kelly Chapman. I'm the Senior Program Coordinator for the Southeast Mental Health Technology Transfer Center School Mental Health Initiative. We're so glad to have you today for part 2 in our series on supporting autistic students in the classroom with anxiety. We encourage you to introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know your name, your role, where you're joining us from. And if you have any technical or audio issues during the course of our presentation, just let us know in the chat and someone from our team can assist you. During the course of today's presentation, we will share a link to a very brief survey in the chat. This survey is required by our funder and allows us to continue to do our work. So we ask that you take a few moments to fill that out. And if you've completed our surveys in the past, we do want to note that SAMHSA has recently changed the surveys to make them easier to complete. And lastly, I'd like to highlight that at the end of this 2-part short survey, you will have access to a certificate of attendance for being at today's presentation, if that's something that you need. Before we get into the presentation, we do have a quick disclaimer. The views, opinions, and content expressed in this presentation do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the Center for Mental Health Services, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Today's session is brought to you by the Southeast Mental Health Technology Transfer Center School Mental Health Initiative. We are located in Atlanta, Georgia at Emory University's Rollins School of Public Health. We are proud to serve the 8 states in HHS Region 4, which are pictured on the slide here. Our center includes faculty and staff with expertise in public health programs, finance, policy, and health systems, which provide us with a unique lens through which we can address the mental health priorities in our region. The goal of our center is to accelerate the adoption of evidence-based mental health programs and practices by providing training and technical assistance to Region 4. And now I'm very happy to introduce our presenter, Dr. Catherine Picard. Dr. Picard is an assistant professor at Emory University School of Medicine and the Marcus Autism Center. She received a doctorate in clinical psychology from Michigan State University and completed a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship at JFK Partners University of Colorado School of Medicine. Her primary research interest is in the translation of evidence-based treatments into community systems that are naturally positioned to serve autistic children and children with other developmental disabilities. Clinically, Dr. Picard is a licensed psychologist and has a strong background in supporting autistic individuals across the lifespan. She holds specific expertise in parent-mediated intervention for young children, as well as cognitive behavioral therapy for autistic youth who have co-occurring anxiety. And now I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Picard.
Thanks so much, Kelly. And it is great to be here today and to see some familiar faces from our webinar 2 weeks ago. Really excited to take what we talked about 2 weeks ago and build upon it a step further by actually talking through what does it mean to actually support autistic kids who may be anxious within school settings. Before we get started today, I just want to give a note on our language choice, which if you've been to a webinar before or read any of our recent products, you've probably seen this as well. But within our products on autism, we use identity first language and have made this decision really in response to the neurodiversity movement based on the preference of many autistic adults and really in an attempt to avoid the use of ableist language. But we recognize that it's not the preference of every person and that many people continue to use person-first language. In our previous webinar 2 weeks ago, we shared, you see at the bottom of the screen here, there's a nice reference to language use, and there's also was a recent paper that came out that summarized language recommendations as it relates to school settings. Like you have gathered from what Kelly mentioned, our team is focused on really disseminating information related to supporting mental health within school systems. And over the past couple of years, we've had a specific kind of subsection of our work that's focused on autistic students and how to support a variety of different things that may pop up in the space of mental health within schools. And so this page here just shows the link to our landing page, which has some of those resources. And Josie just dropped it in the chat box. And so feel free to check that out and see what you think about some of those resources. Whoops. I accidentally clicked on, let me just move my slides. There we go. All right. So today, let's talk about what our goals are. So 2 weeks ago, we focused on how do you identify, right, anxiety in autistic students. And we had a great conversation about what some of those things might be and what might pop up in school settings. This session is really centered on approaches and practices that can be used within schools to actually support anxiety in autistic students. And so by the end of the webinar, we are hoping that participants will be able to describe evidence-based approaches to support anxiety in autistic students, really understand the different ways that mental health programming can be delivered to autistic students in schools, and identify some strategies that might support an autistic student as illustrated in a couple of case examples. And we'll talk about those and the platform we're going to use as it gets closer to those. But before we dive into content, we always start off with just some polling questions about who you are. And so we're interested, and this helps me kind of figure out kind of how to tailor this presentation, but we're interested in understanding what your professional role is, how much of your professional time you spend working with autistic students, and then how much of your time you spend working supporting the mental health or behavioral health of autistic students. So if you could just take a few seconds to fill this out, we'll share it back and get rolling.
Was it just the one question?
There should be a few. So there's, if you scroll down, it asks, what your role is, and there should be a couple others.
I answered the one and then it disappeared.
Oh no, it kicked you out. That's so sad.
Oh.
Same thing with me. I answered one and then it just disappeared.
Oh,
Yes, same thing with me.
oh my goodness. Well, that is just really disappointing. If you wouldn't mind putting some of that into the chat box, I'll put it up right now. So much for letting us know. All right, so we can take this poll with a grain of salt, but it looks like folks, as we would expect in our webinars, represent a range of disciplines, including folks who are directly in the mental health space, but also folks in the special education. I see we have some BCBAs and administrators as well. And consistent, actually, this looks very similar to our webinar 2 weeks ago, where most people, vast majority of people are spending half their time or less working with autistic kids, and same as when it comes to kind of the mental health of autistic kids. So this is helpful, right? Because when we move into strategies, then I appreciate you filling it out. We can talk really kind of concretely about what these things are and what they might look like in schools. Don't have that experience yet. All right, so let's dive into the presentation today and talk a little bit about anxiety and how we might support it in students. So like we've mentioned before in our webinars, we know that autistic students are much more likely to have mental health challenges or experience mental health symptoms than kids and children in the general population. And so these stats here are actually pre-COVID statistics. But for example, anxiety, we know that about 25% of autistic students experience anxiety. And there's actually, if you look kind of across studies, there is a large range in comparison to about 7% or so of the general population. Again, pre-COVID statistics, we know that mental health challenges as a whole have increased since the pandemic. I was able to get some updated statistics for the general population, but was not able to find updated statistics for autistic students. So want to kind of give that caveat. All right, so what is anxiety, right? So Anxiety, we all experience, right? Is a subjective sense of fear or worry, right? A little bit of anxiety actually can be protective. It prevents us from doing things that might be dangerous or that might hurt us. But anxiety disorders occur when symptoms of anxiety are persistent, right? And they really interfere with someone's ability to do things, just basic things, right? Like go to work, go to school, hang out with friends. Um, and right, that's a problem, right? So too much anxiety can really make it hard to do lots of different things. Anxiety disorders range from those that are associated with a specific thing, right? So this could be a phobia, right, of heights, right, or a phobia of bees, for example. Two, anxiety disorders where anxiety is evoked by a broad spectrum of things, right? And so this might be someone who is worried about the future, worried about what's going to happen next, worried about death and dying in the political landscape, right? All of those things, and that worry is really getting in the way for them. So it can look quite different across individuals, but again, we're really when we think about it, we're thinking about, man, how does this show up, and how does it get in the way or make things hard? When it comes to mental health services, especially for autistic kids, I would say this picture we've used for a while, but still is relevant, which is that, services really tend to live in silos. And I'm sure many of you have experienced this, where you have a group of services that were designed right for kids with, for our autistic kids, right? I think about ABA, speech therapy, OT, you know, and we have a workforce, right, that is trained to work with kids with autism. And then we have our mental health services that includes a workforce that was predominantly trained to support mental health, but maybe not the mental health of autistic kids. And so you have, and same with our autism workforce, right? We have people who know autism super well, but maybe weren't trained in mental health. And so it can be very hard to find services and that really kind of bridge those two things, which is a problem given what we know and given how many autistic kids are experiencing anxiety. So when we think about the treatment of anxiety or anxiety supports for autistic kids who are anxious, we think a lot about cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a broad umbrella term, and we're going to break it down today and talk about and give some very concrete examples of what it could look like. But again, CBT is the treatment of choice often for youth within the general population, and it is the treatment of choice for mental health challenges in autistic youth and specifically anxiety. And so the good news, right, is CBT has been around for a long time. And there's a robust, again, body of evidence for it outside of the autism world. And more recently, especially over the last decade or two, we see it, that same evidence in autism. So how does CBT work? So if you were here 2 weeks ago, we talked a little bit about the kind of main components of anxiety and how they show up. And CBT really kind of takes this same framework, but translates it into what do you do to support these things. So for CBT, we think about three things, right? The first being our physiological symptoms of anxiety. We all experience these, right? When we get nervous, we might have a rapid heart rate. We might feel shaky. Our face might get tense. We might look nervous. We might cry, scream, have disrupted sleep, right? That's one camp of things that happens. We also have cognitive things that happen to us. These include distortions, right? Well, which is like blowing things out of proportion. Like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna fail. I'm gonna fall. Everyone's gonna laugh at me. Negative self-talk, rumination. So really getting stuck and having trouble stopping thinking about anxious things, worry and self-doubt. And those things, right? What happens when you experience those things? Well, behaviorally, right? You then do things, right? You might avoid situations that are anxiety provoking. You might withdraw. You might seek reassurance, right? And so you can start to see some of those things pop up, and they can really get in the way, especially when we think about some of those avoidance and withdrawal symptoms. All right, so let's break this down a little bit more because we're going to take this framework and we are going to talk about strategies that fit within this framework. But let's talk about this cycle, this CBT cycle. So we have the trigger, right? So this is the situation that someone might be in. And so for this student, it might be that the parent goes to another floor of the house, right? So, or they leave and run an errand, right? So parent is not in sight anymore. All right. So what might someone think in that situation if they have a fear of being separated from their family? All sorts of things, right? I need my parents so I can be okay. Something bad's going to happen to them. They're not going to come, not going to come back. All of those things. That might make you feel, right, sweaty. You might start to experience those physiological symptoms, have rapid heart rate, dry mouth, or a headache. And what are you going to do, right? You might cry, you might cling to your parents, follow your parents, right? And so, right, or not want to be separated from your parents. Maybe you don't want to go to school because you don't want to be separated from them. So those things can really start to show up. Okay, so let's do this one together. I'm going to encourage you to use the chat box for this. We will be using Jamboard later on, but this is meant to kind of get you thinking about a different situation. Okay, so this is a person who has social worry, right? Social anxiety. So they're worried about maybe being made fun of or being teased, saying the wrong thing and getting laughed at, right? And now they're in a situation, and the situation is being called on in class. So what do you think? Let's do their thoughts first. So they've got they're sweating, their heart's beating. Yeah, exactly. Please drop in what this person might be thinking. Yes, what if I'm wrong? That's a great one that we hear all the time, right? Yes, what if I say the wrong thing? Yeah. What else might that person think? Yeah, I'm gonna be embarrassed or start laughing. Those are great ones. So again, focused on how people are going to respond in that moment. Yes. Yeah, will people laugh at my voice? Will people think I'm stupid? These are fantastic, right? And these are real, right? If we, even if we're not socially anxious, right, it's easy to kind of think through what those things might be that we're experiencing. All right, so if you were thinking those thoughts, right? So if you were worried you're going to get it wrong or get laughed at or teased and you're sweating and starting to get a dry mouth, what would you do in that moment? What might happen? Yeah, you're going to totally avoid, right? Shut down, yes. Head on the desk, refuse to answer, freeze. Yeah, absolutely. And I'll take it, I'm going to go even a step further and say, oh, yes, thank you so much. Yeah, maybe say something off topic and hide. And Teresa, thank you. You said what I was about to say, which is you might actually run away, right? You might actually try and escape. And that can be a real problem and actually a safety concern for kids, right? I appreciate the yelling too. And really speaks to the fact that, right, when kids yell or get really frustrated, throw things, swipe things off their desk, right? I think that, there is a tendency, not always, but for some folks to interpret that behavior as aggression, right? And it is. But I think it's really important to dive a little bit deeper and understand why that might be happening, right? Is it because they just want to get out of something? Maybe. But why do they want to get out of something? Is it hard? Are they worried? We need to really understand the root of that. Yeah. Totally. Yeah, acting out or getting in trouble. Yes, thank you. Lisa Bell, she says, I don't feel well. Can I go home? So trips to the nurse's office, right, are another great example. But right, we put this up to really highlight this is how anxiety starts to get in the way, right? It's not that we may have all experienced at some point a little bit of social anxiety in different situations, but sometimes, right, we can kind of persist and we know, right, that it's probably not going to be that bad and we just are going to raise our hand and we can kind of get ourselves through it. But once we start to go down a path where we're avoiding, getting really upset, right, eloping, doing any of that, it becomes a real challenge and can really interfere. So what do we do, right? So now that we kind of have laid out that pattern, the question becomes obviously how do we support students who really are having a hard time and feeling anxious? So let's talk about the core components of CBT. And I'm going to break these down and give very concrete examples, but I just want to show you how these programs are
Hi,
structured
Nita.
and those core components are. Um, okay, so we're going to first talk, we have psychoeducation, right? And so psychoeducation, again, I'm going to talk a little bit about this, but is broadly speaking, helping kids understand the situations that cause them to feel anxious and how they feel when they're anxious. We then move into teaching often the super jargony word, which somatic management strategies, which really just mean calming strategies. And that's what we'll talk about them as in a little bit. We teach things like cognitive restructuring, which I'm going to, again, really break down and talk about what that means, especially for autistic students. And that really means really changing our thoughts or using calming thoughts. We teach problem solving. And then a super important part of CBT for lots of kids is this kind of what we call graded exposure. And again, very jargony, but what that means is we're going to help kids practice facing their fears just a little bit at a time, right? Because it can be very powerful to learn that actually, yes, I might feel worried, but I can do it, right? And I can slowly kind of overcome this fear that's really making my life hard. All right, so let's talk this through and really kind of lay the foundation here. And again, we're going to then be transitioning into some case studies where we're applying this. But psychoeducation is building that foundational emotion knowledge. So we want to help kids identify common emotions, identify the situations that cause them to feel those emotions, to really think about how our body feels and what our mind does when we experience those emotions, and then learning how emotions can get in the way. And I think this is super important for kids, right? Like no one, right? Talking about anxiety is not fun, right? And a lot of times, like kids are just told, well, just take a deep breath, you can do it, right? Or just you can do it, right? Just push through. And there may not be as much insight into why it's important, you know, to use strategies to feel less anxious. And so we really want to help kids understand how anxiety gets in the way for them. And there are some really nice concrete ways you can do that by helping kids see like, okay, well, how much time do you spend worrying, right? Right. Well, that's like, you know, however much that is less time that you could be spending doing whatever, right? Or man, you're not able to do these fun things that you want because of how anxiety is showing up. And so I think this is a really important piece that often is not talked about or gets overlooked, which is making sure kids are bought in to why we should be talking about these things. All right, so somatic management. So we want to lay that foundation, right? Because it's going to be super hard to work on any strategies if that foundation knowledge is there. It doesn't need to be perfect, right? It's hard. Like some of this stuff is hard, even as adults, right? You know, we don't do a perfect job reflecting on how we feel and why. So this doesn't need to be perfect to then lay the groundwork and start to talk about strategies. But once we've done some psychoeducation, we want to really start to teach some relaxation strategies. And so these are the strategies that are actually going to reduce those physiological symptoms of anxiety or help us calm our bodies. And so I think there are some important things to know here. Many of you may have taught these strategies. They include things like deep breathing, right? Maybe some mindful meditation, going for a walk, listening to music. It doesn't really matter too much. Some sensory regulation strategies fit really nicely here. I think it's important to know that many times students are really relying on adults to soothe them or being told when they need to use strategies. And so we want to build kids' independence in using these strategies so that they're not relying on us or not needing, right, to wait until they're already in the yellow or red zone, right, to start using these things. So we're going to provide kids with a range of relaxing techniques. I think it can be super helpful, not just for autistic kids, but for all kids to use some sort of visual menu to help them understand what their options are. But I think it's really important. Kids will say things like, oh, well, my tablet really helps me calm down, or like, you know, going for a walk, or reading a book really helps me calm down. And those are all great things, and kids should do those things. But we also want to emphasize strategies that are accessible, right? So you may or may not have your tablet, right? Or you may or may not have your favorite book with you. And so what are some things, what are some other things that you can do that might be a little bit easier to use like live and in the moment? And then we want to help kids practice these things across a range of activities. And I sometimes feel like a broken record saying this, but I think the thing that one of the biggest mistakes that folks make is that they're only helping kids use these strategies when they're in the yellow and red zone. And so kids build up a really negative association between things like deep breathing, right? Because like they only hear taking a deep breath when you're upset or anxious. And that's just not the reality, right, of how we ourselves regulate, right? We do things even when we feel good to help us still feel good, right? And so we want to help kids practice these strategies in lots of situations. And even when they are feeling good, right, we want to create routines around them so they become really habitual. And so that way, when they are feeling anxious, it's not so hard to do it. If you only practice, right? If you never practice these things in the green zone and when you're feeling good, it's going to be very hard to use them when you're upset or anxious. This is an example of a visual choice card. I've used these before. I actually have one when I'm looking over here. It's because I have one on my wall next to me. But these are examples of things that you can help kids with. And you may have used these in your practice before, but this is just giving people, again, that visual choice of different ways that they can calm their body. You're going to ask them to kind of pick one, right? These are just some examples, and the visuals could be anything. This is just for this specific person. These were some of the things they wanted to use. We're then going to move into some of those cognitive strategies, right? And so these are strategies that help to manage negative or worrisome thoughts. And I think they're just like our strategies to calm our body. I think there's some really important things to remember about these strategies. First, we want to help kids know what this looks like for them. And so we want kids to be paying attention to some of that negative self-talk and perseverate, like thinking really kind of, honing in on like, what does that look like for them? Perseverative questions and reassurance seeking. Sometimes kids will ask questions like, is it going to be hard? Is there going to be a fire alarm? Am I going to have a substitute teacher? And really kind of, as adults, we need to kind of understand what this might look like for kids. And I think, there is a misconception that when you do CBT, you have to like challenge the negative thought. So like, maybe the thought is, right, like if I raise my hand in class and I say something, my peers are going to laugh at me. And, one might think, well, I need to get the student to realize that that's not true, right? Well, that can be really tricky because first, you run the risk of getting into a power struggle with a kid, and not all negative, unfortunately, not all negative thoughts are totally unrealistic, right? So we have to be very careful about telling kids that they're wrong and that those thoughts are wrong, right? Instead, we really want to be focusing on replacement thoughts. So what's something they could say instead, right? We're not saying that one's wrong, right? Maybe someone's gonna laugh at you, but what are some things you could say instead that are gonna help you get through this? And we really want this to be repetitive, and we want these thoughts to be designed to really kind of reinforce self-competence. So things like, I can do this, right? I've done this before and it was okay, right? Or even if it's hard, I'm gonna get through it, right? Thoughts that can really, be applied to lots of things. This is kind of a corny example, but again, you can use visual supports to help kids with this. And in fact, I have found this to be very helpful because sometimes generating positive thoughts or replacement thoughts is not easy to do. And it's not easy to do on the spot. And if you ask kids, well, what can you say? They're like, I don't know. Like, what do you mean? So I think, again, really thinking through what are those things that they can say instead that might help them get through it. And there are lots of things you could say here that are not depicted on this slide. Some of what I just shared around like, it might be hard, but I've done it before, so I can do it again. Last time I did it, I got through it. Even if they laugh, like I can handle it, right? and things like that. And then I think, finally, I think this is a really important part of CBT. So you can, right, you can do everything we just talked about and stop, right? But I will say that what we know is that, and you all know this too, it's one thing to talk about all these things. Oh, I love that. I'm the boss. What a good thought. We should all have that more. um, you know, we've all, but back to what I was saying, we've all talked about these strategies, right? And you can talk about things all day long. You can practice them in artificial situations, but we know that it is very helpful for kids actually to do some practice in the situations that actually make them feel anxious as a way to help them build that competence and build that feeling of self-efficacy, that they actually know what to do and can overcome some worries. And so graded exposure, I think, is super important. It is graded. It is not, it is not like taking a kiddo who is scared of bees and making them go sit with bees. That is not what graded exposure is, right? It's facing your fears a little bit at a time. So you're working with kids to figure out, like, how do we break this down and how do we start to practice using our strategies a little bit at a time? So maybe, right, we're going to just research bees first. We're going to look at pictures. We're going to look at video. We're going to walk by a trash can outside that sometimes has bees, right? And you don't need to get up to, like, kids don't need, so like you get to decide, right, what those things are. But it's important to think about those things. The reason being, again, it helps kids apply those skills. This is really where we see the heart of change. I will say, and especially in doing work in schools, that it is often the part of mental health and anxiety services that people are least familiar with. I think we get good training and, like, relaxation strategies and cognitive strategies, and I think this is sometimes where we see people are less familiar. I'm just going to show you. So I know there's a lot going on in this slide, but I wanted to give you a snapshot of, like, what this might look like within a specific program. And so there are lots of cognitive behavior therapy programs, and they all have many of them have the same core components. But this just shows you, this is a school-based program. So this is a program that actually was originally kind of based on the Coping Cat curriculum, but then was adapted for autistic kids and for school delivery. But you can see that it's broken up into sessions, right? And you could expand these out if you wanted to, where we're really kind of talking through some of those core components. So you have kind of the learning about emotions. Everybody worries and gets upset, how I react or feel. So again, time spent worrying, right? So how much is worry getting in the way? And then we introduce some ideas of, like, false alarms and how to measure how anxious you are with things like stressimeters. We then kind of teach those strategies that we just talked about: relaxation activities, active minds, and helpful thoughts, putting all those together and moving it into a plan to get to green. And then slowly we kind of move into practice facing your fears. So that includes really, introducing it to kids, having them watch videos where it kind of breaks it down, helping them, right, be an active partner and thinking about, like, how do we get to face our fears, and like what does it look like to be brave, and to create some of those steps, and to then kind of spend a good amount of time helping them practice things. There are lots of ways. In a second, we're gonna transition into our case studies, where we get to talk about some of these strategies and apply them to a couple of student examples. But there are lots of ways to learn about this. I will say that there are, like I mentioned, I'm happy to kind of take questions, at the end of the webinar on this. There are a good number of CBT-based programs for anxiety. And I think the thing to know is that we just want to make sure that they are relevant and applicable for, autistic kids and for schools, right? Because it's a whole different ballgame to be in schools. All right, so I want to just like help us make the transition here. So again, we talked about what what is anxiety and started to break down those components of CBT. And now we're going to transition into a case study activity that we've been using for our last several webinars. And we do this because it's like you can hear, like we could talk about this all day long, but I think we need something concrete to ground us. So we're going to move here in a second into Jamboard. And I think the thing to know is that um, in Jamboard, and we have bumped up into this in the past, there actually is a cap on the number of people who can enter Jamboard. That's okay, right? So if you click on the Jamboard link and you have trouble getting in, know that you can put your comments in the chat box and they will be moved over into Jamboard. So they will make it there. And we're going to be doing an activity together where we break down these case examples and brainstorm some different strategies. And so I am just going to quickly introduce this strategy. And I believe actually, before we do, we do have a polling question. I'm going to move into Jamboard actually, because it's going to be easier than introducing this and then moving. And we'll do the polling in the Jamboard. So let me just share. I'm going to reshare Jamboard. Let's see, here it is. All right. Okay. So this is our first case study, and then we are going to ask a polling question first. So then we'll move into our, open-ended sticky notes. So the case study is that Sam is in the 4th grade, and she does not have an autism diagnosis, but participates in the school lunch bunch group and receives support related to ADHD and a learning disability. Sam is enrolled in general education and receives pull-out support for reading and math. Over the past academic year, her school team has noticed that Sam is not raising her hand in class and puts her head on her desk when called on or looks frozen when she's called on. Her team has also noticed that Sam seems to ask repetitive questions when it comes to upcoming tests and assignments. Is it going to be hard? When is it due? And her mother shared that Sam is also asking her a lot of questions at home about upcoming assignments and is starting to complain about her stomach aches, before school. Her school team is wondering if anxiety is at play and what their next step should be to support her. So, question 1, right? I'm interested to hear from you. What strategies would you prioritize using to support this student, so Sam, in managing her anxiety? And you can click more than one. And we'll share back this, and then we'll move into the case study, the Jamboard. Awesome. So, right, this it's like not meant to be a tricky question. Like we probably would teach lots of different things. But yes, I appreciate seeing this, right? So we're going to teach calming strategies, helpful thoughts, deep breathing, provide the student with more accommodations. This is super important, and we're going to get to this on the next slide. And then we do want to help them maybe practice facing their fears, and we're going to talk about what this could look like. Yeah, I appreciate that, Rita, right? We do want to, and we're going to, again, talk about this, but one of our strategies absolutely should be thinking about what accommodations or what types of supports might also reduce anxiety. So here's where we get to use Jamboard even more. So if you're in Jamboard, you can actually use there's a sticky note function. And so what you'll do is click the sticky note. You can type your response on it and click save, and it will show up. But I think the caveat to know is that I've tried to make some categories, because if you were here 2 weeks ago, it was great using Jamboard, but a lot of things came in and we were trying to categorize them as they came in. So we decided to pre-populate some categories for you. So if you dug a little deeper and learned that Sam is worried specifically about doing poorly on tests or saying the wrong answer, what types of environmental or academic supports or accommodations might you consider for Sam? So this goes directly to your point in the chat earlier. So what things might you consider before you even start to kind of tackle the anxiety piece? And please, if you're open to this, actually trying to do some grouping, I'll also help you. But we'll have you if you're able to kind of move it. Awesome. So small group, yes. So maybe, right, she's worried about what her peers are going to be thinking about her. And so maybe being in a small group environment is going to reduce some of that anxiety. Awesome. So making sure she is sleeping well, giving her some tutoring as needed. Awesome. Asking Sam what she needs. Okay, hold on. So I'm going to do a little bit of grouping again. I think this is the categories are a little tricky to tease apart, but I'm going to move the planner over to, it's not really, it's a pretty informal support, but I'm going to move it over more into that academic domain. Okay, I love this person's like just asking what Sam needs first. Small group, separate setting, getting kind of maybe budding her up with a peer. I love those.
We had a crisis and I didn't get to read.
Her rating.
Yeah.
Yeah, giving her some prep before she gets asked a question in front of the whole class. And this is going to actually relate a little bit to practicing facing fears. But I love that. You're thinking about, okay, we want to give her again just that warning before she's there. Yeah, maybe we're chunking information, allowing her to demonstrate her knowledge in other ways. Yeah, I love the idea about thinking about the test format. There's so many things that we could do. And I want to put this asking Sam what she wants here. We're not going to do all of these things. We may need to dig a little deeper to figure out which specific environmental or academic support she might need. But, right, we can absolutely be thinking about some of these things, in terms of, awesome. I'm going to move some of these over here, reading the test out loud and front loading, right? I think why we hit this hard is because, right, like before we do any work around anxiety strategies, we want to make sure kids are in environments and getting the accommodations they need to, right, actually kind of make that anxiety support a little more successful. All right. So again, we're going to move a same question. Try to do one Jamboard at a time. If you dug a little deeper, and again, Sam's still worried about doing poorly on tests or saying the wrong answer, what types of other peer supports might you give her, right? Or other supports that we haven't already talked about. There were a couple of peer suggestions on the previous page, but is there anything you'd be thinking about, right? She's worried that students are going to laugh at her, right? So what might you be thinking about in the classroom? And then what are some other things that we haven't talked about? Yes. Work with a buddy. Yeah, absolutely. Small group sessions, beautiful. What if peers were actually laughing at her, right? I think like I say that because for some kids, right, their worry is real because they're in an environment where they're either experiencing bullying or experiencing other forms of victimization. So what would you do? Yeah. Yeah, I think we want definitely be thinking about these things, right? Well, how do we change classroom environment? You know, that's a hard thing. And what are some ways that we can either model and reinforce what that looks like, or yes, to this person's point, maybe if there's a specific situation that's playing out with a peer, think about that. Yeah, yeah. I say that again, and if you were in our talk 2 weeks ago, we talked about the fact that, our autistic kids are more likely to be bullied and victimized. And so when we see social anxiety, I think it's really important to think about like, well, is that anxiety rooted in real experiences that kids have had? And I think that's really important to know as a person working with them. Awesome. I love these other supports too. So calming corner is fantastic. What are some other essentially kind of strategies that that Sam can access that might help her feel more regulated? Okay. Awesome. Well, I want to make sure we're moving here. So those were our environmental accommodations, and the person who just put that calming corner in it, that triggered me to move, right? Because, right, so you put these accommodations in place, right? You address the class, you give her some academic accommodations, you give her some environmental accommodations, and Sam is still super worried, right? She's putting her head down on the desk and really kind of worried about doing poorly on tests. So what are the strategies that you're going to use to help her relax or calm her body? And how might you have her practice facing her fears? Love that. Yeah. I love it. Mint, water, right? Ensuring that the somatic, yeah, music. We could ask Sam these things too, obviously, but assuming that obviously have not talked to Sam. Deep breathing, yeah, super important. And there are amazing apps now that can facilitate deep breathing, and there are so many different ways to do it. Taking a walk, love that. Hydrating, counting to 10, all those things. And I think the thing to know, I love the person who put in kind of those sensory supports as well. I think the thing I just want to emphasize here is we want to help Sam use these strategies when she's feeling not anxious, right? We want to kind of do a rundown and build a routine around using these strategies. So that way, when she is in her classroom and they're about to take a test, or she's in their classroom and the teacher is about to do a group discussion, she can access the strategies because she's practiced them before. All right, thank you for those who have moved into practice facing your fears. Okay, so let's talk about this. Yes, we are totally going to do graded exposure. Role play, I love that. So how might we help Sam gradually do this? We're not going to like throw her into a really scary situation, but yes, we might one-on-one, and maybe we vary the role play. Maybe first it's role play with someone familiar, maybe it's role play with a peer, but then maybe role playing with her real teacher is a little bit harder, but it's still role play. So even within the role play, right, you could break down what that looks like. Yeah, you said it very well. Practice simulating testing environments with low stakes, non-graded material, or even silly. Yes, that's exactly right. So we're going to break it down. This is not standardized testing, right? First, maybe it's just a, a fake silly assignment. Maybe then it's a silly assignment, but it's graded, right? Maybe it's a hard assignment, but there's no grade. You could think about the different ways you could potentially vary that. And Sam gets to help you, right? You're not going to do this without her. She's going to help you think about like what are the ways that she could start to practice and really overcome her fears so she can feel good at school and work on some of these things. Yeah, practice tests. Thank you so much. Awesome. I will say just one other thing that I would say, and I don't know if we talked about this explicitly yet, but we do want to be thinking about the skills that Sam may want to practice that are going to help her with, like, for example, answering kind of a teacher question. So you may want to help Sam know, when do you say something when the teacher calls on you, or when do you just say, I don't know, right? Or what are some other things she could say, like that would be like easy things that she could say, right? That would kind of get her through that situation, right? We all say things in situations where we're asked questions. Sometimes we answer the questions, and that's great. Sometimes we kind of fib our way through an answer, right? Sam doesn't need to do that, right? And sometimes we just say, I don't know, or that's a great question. And so we could actually help her build some skills around what do you actually do when you're called on, or when you're taking a test, what do you do when you don't know an answer? right? Well, there's some things we may want to kind of practice around, taking our best guess, right? Or eliminating answers and thinking about that stuff. The only thing I'll just say, one more quick thing. Yeah, practice becoming more comfortable with being silly. I love that. Silly is a great way to break the ice with kids. This facing your fears it should not be punishment. Again, we're teaching kids, right? We want to empower them to feel like, man, I am nervous of these things, but I can do it, right? I can do it. And when I do it, like my life gets a little bit easier, or I feel accomplished, or I get to have more fun. I love this, the power of yet. Some DBT based strategies. We do want to give Sam some ways to kind of have more productive and helpful thoughts. It sounds like she really is a worrier, and there may be some rote thoughts that we want her to use. Well, this is awesome. I really kind of appreciate breaking this down because it is helpful and just not always that straightforward how you might do that. And especially for kids who have these more general worries, right? Specific worries like bugs, specific worries like heights or elevators, those are a little bit easier, right? Or it's just only so many steps. When kids have this diffuse worry about lots of things, we really do want to be working with kids to understand, like, what's the worry, right? Because that's going to help us understand how to support them in facing their fears. Okay, I'm going to skip over this because we started to do some of the worrisome thoughts in that previous slide. And I think just given our time, I do want to be able to spend some good time on our second case study. I'm going to move into it. And the reason we do a second case study is because how you support students, right, looks quite different depending on how old they are, right, and what specific worries they have, and all of those things that you know. And so we're going to do one more. And I believe there is a polling question for this one as well, but I'll read the case study first. And so this case study is that Jack is in the 8th grade at a large public middle school. And he did receive an autism diagnosis when he is in kindergarten. And he qualifies for an IEP with an autism designation. Jack participates in general education, and he does well, but he doesn't like group work and is quick to correct others if they don't follow the rules, and becomes upset when peers are off topic, loud, or not contributing to the project. So peers are starting to make fun of him, and they're calling him the rules police. When there's a group project, he's now saying, I don't want to do it, or he goes to the nurse with complaints of a headache. And he has a hard time at lunch and recess where he says it's too loud and he doesn't like being watched. He is protesting going to both activities and asked to go to the library instead. And his school team's wondering if anxiety is at play and what their next step should be to support him. And we intentionally picked these. These are the same cases for those of you who were here last week, the same cases, as a way to kind of, again, take what we learned previously and extend it out further to actually talk about those strategies. So I believe we do have a polling question first. And this is just a question to get, again, just to kind of get you starting to think, and then we'll move into our Jamboard.
Catherine, while folks are asking that, there was a question in the chat about autistic kids who don't use spoken communication. So I don't know if that's something you want to address now or later.
Yeah, that's a great question. I will address it after this case study, and I'm excited to talk about that. Thank you. Well, thanks for doing that. And again, those are kind of our generic strategies, and not surprising, right? It looks quite similar to our other polls here. So we're going to teach Jack all sorts of things, right? Likely deep breathing, other calming strategies. Folks have alluded to so many others, right, that are not deep breathing, going for a walk, listening to music. Teach helpful thoughts, provide him certainly with more accommodations, and help him practice facing his fears. Okay, so let's break it down. We're going to start off with those accommodations first, right? Again, that's our lens. What do we need to change environmentally, about kind of the academic accommodations, about, anything to kind of make sure that Jack has what he needs before we start to practice facing our fears. So you're going to see this is structured the same way. So I'm just going to show you in case you want to kind of toggle back and forth. But we have environmental supports, right? So what about Jack's environment might we change? What are some academic supports we might want to think about? What are those peer supports that we may need to be addressing? And then what else, right? So again, we're not yet focusing on anxiety. We're really zooming out and focusing on the things that might be driving anxiety that actually could be changed to make things easier for Jack. So what do you guys, what comes to mind for some of these different categories? Awesome. Okay, and feel free, yes, I'll help you kind of move things, but feel free to do your best sorting as well, and that will definitely make things a little bit easier too. Awesome. Yeah. Okay. So headphones for lunch and recess. I think that's huge, right? Like we're not expecting Jack to somehow tolerate a horribly loud situation. That feels really not okay. Right. So love the idea of headphones. Yeah. Noise canceling headphones. Yeah, I love that. Going to recess a few minutes early before the whistle's blown or really kind of heading out before it's blown, thinking about how to avoid or change or get around some of the things that make recess hard. Yeah, alternative resource. Frequent breaks for academics, having the option to work alone. Yeah, I think the question I would ask the teacher is like, what is the purpose of the group work, right? Does it need to be a group work? Is there something that students are learning via group work? And what are the alternatives for a kiddo who may even be being teased within group work? Yeah, prepping students that will be in his group. And that kind of goes into the peer supports too. So making sure that his peers are being an effective partner in some of those activities. Oh my gosh, these are so good. I love this. Allowing him to choose his partners or groups. That's fantastic, right? If there are certain kids that have been hard, right? He's going to know. Jack knows, right? And so we can ask him if there are preferred groups. So good. Okay, and again, yes, physical, checking out home environment. We talked a lot about this 2 weeks ago, which is when we're thinking about anxiety, obviously school is just one situation that kids are in. Granted, they're at school a lot. We want to be thinking about what's going on at home. And we certainly want to be thinking about whether there may be other things, either with someone's family or someone's health, right? Sleep that could be driving. Yeah, these are good. Okay. Oops, I'm sorry. I moved it right when someone put it on. Perfect. Yes. So we want to kind of give him the option for group work or give him another opportunity. Okay. Okay. Oh, that's great. I'm just sorry. I'm reading the chat too, which is why I'm looking over here. Yeah, so Nicole, you had said the teacher structures grading. So it's clear to Jack, right, that he's not going to be penalized for his group members' poor performance, right? Yeah. So if one of the worries, right, is that his group is really not pulling their weight and his grade is going to suffer as a result of it, that's a great strategy, right? It's just to remind him. And maybe that's even a helpful thought that he learns and practices too, which is like they're not going to impact me. Like, I can still get a good grade, even if they're doing it. And yes, you can definitely get a copy of the PowerPoint. Any other? Okay, I see, Emily, you're talking about some of those peer supports. So lunch bunch, recess bunch, where adult gives and monitors conversation to help model and allow him safer ways, right, to practice building friendships. That's fantastic. What might you do? I think this goes back to the same question with Sam, which is in a classroom where kids are calling him the rules police, what might you do? thinking about some of the things we talked about with Sam specifically. So, right, I mean, I think this is a tricky situation, and I ask it because I think it's super important, and other kids experience this. So we really do want to make sure that kids are in spaces that are safe for them when possible, and I think that I would be thinking about some of the things that we talked about with Sam, which is, are there specific students where this is an issue, right? And if so, can we partner with those students and really think about how to effectively teach them? Yes. Can we have a group discussion? Um, I think teaching peers about Jack's needs and why he might act the way as well, discussing how labeling, I think super important. We want to, again, address that context that may just be fueling some of his anxiety, right? And thinking about how we can break that cycle too. Yeah, remind the reasons for the rules and validate it. Yep. Yeah. Like, I think, thank you. Whoever put that in the chat. Like, rules do exist, right? Like, and I think that obviously they're there for a reason, and Jack reinforcing them is not like he's just following the rules in a lot of ways. All right, teaching tolerance. This is great. Yeah, I know. Yeah. I mean, that's super important, right? Like, sometimes these problems really aren't within the power of kids, and I think are within their control. And I think but that is where, as educators and mental health staff, it's our job to really kind of understand when things are out of their control, and whether there are things, and there may not always be, but whether there are things that could actually kind of support students in those situations. All right, so self-soothing skills has cued me. And we're just gonna go, and I just wanna remind you that there are 2 slides here, and I know we're kind of, we have it structured the way we do because it can be, like, from a space standpoint, it can get a little crowded when there are lots of different categories, but we're gonna ask the question. So we have, assuming that after accommodations, Jack is still worried about loud noises or peers making fun of him, right? So what might you do in this situation? What are some of the strategies that you would use to help him relax or calm his body? What are some of the strategies you would help him use to manage his worrisome thoughts? And then how might you help him practice facing his fears? And what else would you be thinking about here? And so feel free, you're welcome to start like in whatever section. I'm going to keep it on this first one. But please, folks have already started to allude to this, but what are you going to do to support Jack in managing his anxiety? Yeah, we're totally going to help him practice positive self-talk. We want him to feel like he, right, has the skills and and feels confident in how to manage his worry. So positive self-talk for him can be all sorts of things. People have already alluded to it. I can do this, right? Like, it doesn't matter what they think, right? Or, recess is hard, but, if I'm there before the whistle, I may not have to hear loud noises, right? Or if it's hard, I can just go take a break, right? I can do it. Sometimes I have fun at recess, right? Awesome. Asking for help, modeling self-talk. Oh, I love this. Okay, the person who put in asking for help, thank you, right? I think, again, it goes back to what we were talking about with Sam, which is that we may need to be thinking also about specific skills that Jack may need to know that are going to help him navigate these situations, right? So maybe it is loud and he does need to ask an adult, or he needs to advocate for himself and go to an adult and say, it's really loud and I need a break, right? Or, this student is really bothering me. And so we do want to make sure that he feels like he can get the help he needs. Yeah, so good. I love the 3 positive affirmations, providing daily options, as one day may be harder than others, for sure, right? And we may use different strategies for different reasons, right? When we're just a little anxious, deep breathing might work. When we're in the red and freaking out, right? a deep breath may not be enough. In fact, we may not, we may or may not be able to use it. And in fact, like as we get further into the red zone and more anxious, it can be hard to use those helpful thoughts. And so we want to be thinking about what are some of the different strategies that we might use depending on how anxious we're feeling. And a lot of programs have something like that built into them, where kids not just are generating strategies, they're kind of mapping on when they might use the strategies, depending on how anxious they are. Yeah, I love this. I love the skill building pieces. I'm just going to group them together. Yeah, mindfulness, exercise, self-soothing. All of those are really important strategies. Getting a cold drink. And what I love about that, well, exercise, I'm not sure, but a lot of these can be very accessible in schools, right? So taking a break, taking a deep breath, getting a cold drink, all of those things can be pretty straightforward. All right, using fidgets, some of those sensory strategies can go in multiple things. And then I love that this person who put in visual supports. We definitely want to use visual supports. I will say, especially for our autistic students, right? It can be very hard. It's hard for us to answer open-ended questions. What should you do in this situation? How do you feel? What can you say to yourself? Those are hard questions. And so using visual supports can really help kids. Okay, I need to calm my body. What are my options here? I'm going to pick this one. I need to calm my mind, right? My mind is racing. What are my options here? All right. And then I do want to make sure we talk about the question around spoken communication. I just want to wrap up by asking how Jack might practice facing his fears, or how you might help him practice facing his fears. And this is a trickier one. Remember, his two worries are loud noises and peers making fun of him. And we probably need to dig a little bit deeper to understand, like, what are the situations where this is coming up, and things like that. But what might you be thinking about? Yeah, I see a comment asking him to identify worst case scenario, right? So yeah, we want to know, like, I think that's a great question. So like, what is it that really is the hardest for Jack? And you may be able to, from there, really kind of break down it into smaller components. Yeah, the noise one is tricky, right? Because we don't want to make Jack do things that are like extremely aversive, especially if he has sensory differences. But I think it is worth a conversation with Jack around what is tolerable, right? And what isn't. And maybe there are certain situations that, right, are hard to wear noise canceling headphones that he wants to practice in. Maybe, right, he really wants to be at recess, right? And he doesn't want to wear his headphones, right? That might be a situation. So for the noise especially, you want to dive in with him and really understand what are no-goes, right? And what are things that may actually be worth diving into. Yeah. Because some things can be quite hard. Okay. I am just catching up on some of the sticky notes coming in. Okay. Yeah, for sure. So I'm going to group some of these into the facing your fears and then some into the other support. Yes. So maybe he does want to practice, right? Especially because he wants to be part of recess, and that whistle, whoever read that whistle is really tricky, right? So maybe, right, we're practicing the whistle at a very low volume, a little bit higher, giving him warning before it, right? And those types of things. So that could be one way to go about doing it. Yeah, how to discreetly cover his ears. That's a great idea. So we're, again, going back to the skill building that we might need to help Jack with, right? If he doesn't have his headphones, what the heck do you do, right? And he may not, and that's hard. How do you get through that? All right. Yeah. And for this worry with peers, it's, we want to dive a little deeper to know exactly what the worry is. Is it worry that he's going to get made fun of? Is it worry that, is he nervous, like just talking to kids, right? Is he nervous and like at lunch that people are looking at him? And we really kind of want to dive in. So it might mean practicing assertiveness in different situations, right? It might mean talking to kids, right? And maybe it's first his friends and then kids who are less familiar and less familiar. But there's got to be some skill building that goes into that too. Awesome. Okay, I'm just moving some of these things, catching up. Okay, great accommodations. Yeah. Set a timer in your office. Yeah. So you're again giving him that warning. Mhm. Awesome. Okay. Oh, allow him to blow the whistle. This is fantastic. So I think the point of this exercise is to not land on like the exact right ways to practice facing fears, but to really be thinking about the nuance that you're going to be considering when you're working with Jack, which is again, what are the accommodations first? Okay, now what really is the worry, right? And like, how is it getting in the way and showing up? And then from there, what are some specific steps that we could help Jack with? And like lots of kids, we don't need to get to the hardest thing, right? Like we don't need to, as adults, right? We don't need to do that either. And so, but we just want to help kids practice in these situations. Again, it's as a way to build confidence, right? I felt anxious, but I did it, right? And when I did it, I was able to have fun at recess, right? I was actually able to run around with some kids, and that felt good. And so it's really about building confidence and kids understanding how they can go about practicing facing fears in a way that does not feel so intimidating. Yeah. All right. So we're going to transition back into the PowerPoint in a second. I do just want to address before we do the question around spoken communication and how to work with kids who are not using spoken communication or maybe who have an intellectual disability. And I think the thing to know here is that there is some good research. Some of it was being done and is still being done while I was at the University of Colorado that has looked at, is CBT effective for students and teens who are not speaking or who are speaking but have an intellectual disability, maybe is a better way of phrasing it. And what we know is that it is, right? But, right, how you deliver it is going to be slightly different. And so I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen. I'm just going to show the core components slide and just talk you through that super quickly. Whoops. Okay, let me just see here. Whoops, went a little too far. Okay, right, so CBT remains unaltered, right? So these are core components. These are what we helps kids get better for lots of students, right? For students who don't have autism, for autistic students, and for students who are not speaking or who have an intellectual disability. And so what becomes different then, right? Like your question is a valid one, which is that how you deliver it is not quite going to be the same. And so I'd be thinking about what level of visual support does this student need and what is their kind of expressive and receptive language skills and cognitive skills, because that is going to drive how you deliver the program. But psychoeducation might look quite different. You're not going to be asking kids open-ended questions, right? And you may not be doing, you're definitely not going to have them do, you may not be having them do worksheets, or maybe you might, depending on kind of their academic skills, but you may have pictures, right? Of situations that make them feel good, situations that make them feel anxious, and you may have them sort them into red, yellow, and green bins, right? To kind of help them and label that while they're doing it, help them make the associations about these situations cause me to feel this type of emotion. Visual supports are super important in this situation. And so the visual supports that I showed are super relevant for and again, I think like I want to make it clear that like you want to understand the kiddos overall skills, but for kids who have an intellectual disability, using visual supports and being very consistent about their use can be very helpful, right? We're going to calm our body. Let's practice. Here are the options. I'm going to model it, right? And kind of help you do it. And same with for kids who do have some kind of phrase communication or who are using an AAC device, you can have them use, right, some of these some of these helpful thoughts, right? You can program them into their AAC device. You can have them on a visual choice card, and we're teaching, we're going to calm our body, take a deep breath. We're going to calm our mind. I can do it. And we're still going to help students kind of practice applying those skills. A visual schedule to help them practice facing their fears can be really useful. So we're going to get them into a routine, right? I calm my body, check. I calm my mind, check. I practice facing my fear, check. I get a reward, right? And so again, I don't want to oversimplify, right? Like what that would look like, but I want to emphasize that, again, that CBT can be delivered for, autistic kids who have an intellectual disability. I would be thinking just about, and I'm happy to kind of answer questions offline or over email about it, but I would be thinking just about kind of overall skills and level of support needs, and trying to kind of accommodate those things. All right, I am mindful of our time. It is almost 1:06, going on 1:06. Please, I'm just going to move through these. This is what we talked about. We are going to just do a wrap up here, and I want to encourage you to stay on because we will have, like Kelly mentioned, a poll and a feedback survey that are super helpful for us. It helps us just determine like what additional topics we might cover in our presentations, and it's feedback, specifically for this presentation. But before we get there, I just want to do a couple more polling questions. Again, we use these to help us understand what types of information we should continue to disseminate and in what format. And so I'm hopeful for this poll that it doesn't, it allows you to answer multiple questions. But the questions we have for you are, what are mental health topics that you would like more information on? And then for the topics that you identify, how would you want that information presented? And so these are just a few examples. If there are others that are not listed in this poll, please feel free to drop them in the chat box. Like Kelly mentioned, we're open and super interested in disseminating information that's relevant and practical to educators. Awesome. I just want to share this back, and just so you all can see what people are wanting to know. And emotion regulation is one of them, which is great. Emotion regulation is core to a lot of different mental health challenges, not just anxiety. Trauma-informed care is extremely important. Executive function, neurodiversity affirming practices, which is something that we've considered doing webinars on, but wanted to kind of gauge whether that is a topic of interest to folks. And then for the topics you identify, live webinar seems to be the most prevalent. That's great to know, and super helpful. I would just encourage you, if you haven't already, to check out our mental health toolkit related to autistic students that's on the Southeastern Mental Health Technology Transfer Center webpage. It's got lots of things, including recorded webinars, in addition to infographics that cover anxiety, emotion regulation, challenging behavior, executive function, and all of that. Kelly, I'm just going to toss it to you for the evaluation and certificate, and then I figure we can open it up.
Perfect. Yes. So you can find the link in the chat to fill out the brief survey we've mentioned. It has 2 parts and it's very brief. The end of the second part will get you to a certificate of attendance if that's something you need for today.
So that will go in the chat box. I just wanted to share that, so thank you in advance for doing this survey. Again, it's super helpful feedback for us. If you are interested in kind of checking out our resources, the link to our homepage is there. And you're also welcome to email me directly with questions that you have. I will also drop my email in the chat box here.
Where do we get the link to do the survey and the certificate?
It looks like it was just dropped in the chat box. So just one comment above my email. Yep, so you can find it right there.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And I just want to also, open it up for questions. and happy to kind of answer specific questions that may have come up. You're welcome to unmute yourself or use the chat box, and we can do that. Yes, Cynthia, I see your hand up.
Hello, I'm Cynthia from Cleveland. I'm a community health worker. And I also have my great grandchild who has autism. And I was wondering what type of services or resources are available for the parents to reiterate some of these strategies that you reviewed.
Oh,
No.
what a fabulous question. I did not, it's so interesting. I did not cover them in great detail today, in part because I was in my head thinking like school-based services, right? And it can be tricky to figure out the best way to engage parents in services that are being delivered at school. However, when we think about CBT specifically, and a lot of clinic-based versions of the program and school programs too, do have an active caregiver or parent component. And so it can look lots of different ways. Sometimes that's actually a formal thing, right? So maybe it's that there's like a 5 to 10 minute check-in with the parent at the end of session. There are actual groups sometimes that are run that give parents strategies. And when we're working with students who have higher support needs, we definitely want parent involvement, right? Because it is not fair to expect kids to just miraculously, right, take what they learn and apply it. So we want to be thinking about how we support parents. And anxiety is hard when you're a parent, right? It can be hard to manage. And my answer to your question is many, not all, but many CBT programs do have a component or resources that can be shared with parents, and that's super important. So I appreciate you bringing it up.
Okay, and my second question, and then I'm gonna let somebody else have it. You know, children with autism, sometimes they're under special medication regimen. And then is there like and their medication regimens may be changed.
Huh.
And then I see a disconnect when it comes to the impact of the behavior of the child during this time period with maybe the school, the parents, and from a clinical perspective. And I was wondering, is there some type of coordination or care management coordination with the schools and the parents to address the medical side of autism, to help the children, and teachers in the learning environment have better outcomes
Oh,
for the students.
good. Another really good question. You're right that some autistic kids are also taking medication for any number of things, right? Maybe it's for co-occurring medical conditions, right? Or maybe it's for mental health, conditions too. So maybe it's for anxiety or depression or emotion regulation or whatnot. What I'll say is it really depends on the state you live in and how school mental health services are delivered. Um, but largely speaking, right, to your point, there isn't always that connection or medical home for kids. And so we have services that can be quite disjointed, right? You might have a mental health provider at school or your kind of education team, and there might be, right, a pediatrician, a psychiatrist, or someone else who's providing services in the community, or maybe you have a BCBA, right, or a speech therapist in the community, and those services often are not coordinated super well. And so I think I don't know that I have a great answer for how to better coordinate those things, because some of it really does depend on kind of the state and delivery system, but to validate that it really is an issue. And it is an issue, especially when we think about mental health services, where people may be approaching it from different angles, and that can send confusing messages to families and kids. Yeah. Such a good question. Other questions or comments before we wrap up for today? Well, I really appreciate you showing today and attending and just providing such thoughtful strategies and suggestions related to accommodations. And so these slides will be available and the recording is also available for this presentation. So you're welcome to watch it, to share it, to disseminate it in whatever way. And I just think that I just want to reiterate, if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them over email. So if you're like me and I don't know like what specific program or I have a specific situation here, you're welcome to shoot me an email. So thank you so much. And I will be on for the next few minutes. So if other questions come up, you're welcome to pop them in the chat or unmute yourself. But we really appreciate it.